Intro Algebra Lesson 2-2A. So we've taken our differences of different types of numbers with integers and natural numbers and whole numbers and real numbers. And now we're going to look at some very specific type of integers, the positive and the negative numbers. And we want to think about how we deal with each one of those. So pretty easy when we're adding positives and positives, but now we're going to be also dealing with negatives. So we have to make sure that we're understanding how exactly it works when we put those together. So first of all, we have some addition rules. Now these are rules that work with addition, which means that later on when we're talking about subtraction, I'm going to try to give you some suggestions on how to deal with subtraction to actually make them more similar to the addition rules. So first of all, you have to realize that anytime you take a positive and you add another positive, you're going to get more positives. This is what we've all spent all of our time with, and we're pretty strong with this. All right? Positives plus positives equals more positives. If I have 5 and I add 3 to that, I get 8. All right? And any negative plus a negative is going to equal more negatives. In the same way that this equaled more positives, it works when you take negatives to add more, you get more negatives. So if we were looking at this and we said negative 3 plus, I'm sorry, that's not negative, I'm going to do positives up here. If I said positive 3 plus positive 2, you would get 5. Another way of looking at that is making little plus signs. So if you had 3 plus signs and you added 2 more plus signs, you would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plus signs. So 3 positives and 2 positives make 5 positives. All right, down here with the negatives, it's the same idea. If we were to say negative 2 plus negative 4, negatives plus negatives just make more negatives. That's like saying a negative and a negative. And then a negative, 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 negative. So we have these 2 plus those 4 equal plus equal. So that's another way of looking at it. Negatives plus negatives make more negatives. People are pretty good with these two. This one obviously very good because they've had the most experience and practice with it. This one they're not too bad because it makes sense that the negatives plus the negatives would make more. But where it gets really tricky is when we're talking about a negative plus a positive. You've got to ask yourself 2 questions. At least this is what I would really suggest you do every time until you're absolutely sure that you have the skills down, is number 1, do you have more positives or negatives? So you look at the problem and you go, let's see, a negative 5 and a positive 7. Well, I've got more positives. 7 is more than negative 5. So you always ask yourself that question first, because whatever the answer is, if you say you have more positives, your answer is going to be positive. If you say you have more negatives, your answer is going to be negative. So question number 1 is pretty important. It tells you the type of answer you're going to have. Step number 2, or question number 2, how many more? Simple question. How many more do you have? If you have more, how many more do you have? And that will give you your answer. All right? So let's take a look at what that could look like. Let's say we are taking negative 5 and we are adding positive 9. According to question number 1, do we have more positives or more negatives? There's 5 negatives, there's 9 positives. I think we have more positives. So we would have more positives. That tells us our answer is positive. The question then becomes number 2, how many more positives? Well, 5 negatives and 9 positives, that's 4 more positives. So we would say positive 4. Negative 5 and positive 9 make 4. What if we had, instead of this scenario, we had negative 6 plus a positive 2. Now we answer question number 1, there's more negatives than there are positives. That means our answer is going to be negative. Right? There's more negative. So negative 6 and a positive 2. How many more negatives? There are 4 more negatives. So we would say negative 4 is our answer. So there's 2 examples of how that would work. Right? Some more examples. Negative 3 plus 5. Do you have more positives or more negatives? You got more positives. How many more? 2 more. So negative 3 plus 5 is 2. Do you have more positives or more negatives? More positives again. How many more? 1 more. There's 8 positives and 7 negatives. It's only 1 more positive. Alright? Uh-oh, a little harder. 16 plus negative 35. This time you have more negatives and the question is how many more. If you're having a hard time doing this in your head, put whatever you have more of on top. We had more negatives, so we'll put it on top, and subtract what you have less of. Now you can't do 5 minus 6. You don't want to do up-down subtraction and go 21. That will give you a bad answer. You got to borrow. So now you have 15 minus 6 is 9, 2 minus 1 is 1. There's 19. But we already know the answer is negative, so we would say that this is negative 19. That's how many more negatives there are than your positives. Alright? What if there's more than 2 numbers involved? That's okay. One thing I do, since it's addition, you can add in any order you want. So I like to put all the negatives together because I know that negatives plus negatives makes more negatives. So the negative 6 plus the negative 5 equals negative 11. So I know that. Then I have negative 11 from here being added to the 9. So do I have more negatives or do I have more positives? I've got more negatives. Question is how many more? 2 more negatives than I had positives. First I combined all the negatives, then I dealt with adding positive and negative together. Alright, another scenario, these two right here, negatives plus negatives makes more negatives, so we would have negative 25 being added to the positive 4. Whenever you add a positive and a negative, you ask yourself, do you have more positives or do you have more negatives? I think we clearly have more negatives than positives. And how many more? The answer would be 21 more negatives. And another one. Now it's really big. That's okay. Doesn't matter how many there are. Look at the problem and say, alright, these two are both negative. Negative 7 plus negative 3. Negatives plus negatives makes more negatives. And the negative are the 14, the 7, and the 8. 14 plus 7 plus 8. Well, you just add positive numbers like you would any other positive number, so you end up with 29. The last thing you have to do is take all the negatives and add them to all the positives, and you have to ask yourself, do you have more positives or do you have more negatives? We have 10 negatives, and we have 29 positives. I think it's clear that we have more positives. The question is how many more? I'm not really sure. Put whatever you have more of on top, take away what you have less of, and that's how many you'll have more of. So the answer would be 19, because we had more positives, so it's a positive 19 answer. These rules right here are pretty important. Positive plus a positive makes more positives. A negative plus a negative makes more negatives. But when you're dealing with positives and negatives together, you got to ask these two questions. Which do you have more of, and how many more do you have?